Welcome back to Before the Day Ends. So we're in chapter 14 now, which is in the fourth book of Matthew. So if you want to go back and take a look at the outline that we set forth, we're in the fourth book. So this is the narrative, the story section of the fourth book. And here we're going to start looking at Jesus as he moves now toward the crucifixion. And we're going to see actually what I consider to be the climax of the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 15. And so this is going to be kind of a setup for that. So be looking for that climax in chapter 15. All right, in chapter 14, we start off with basically a birthday party. Herod, the tetrarch, is having a birthday party, and Herodias, his wife, who's also his half-niece, is kind of throwing the party. And her daughter dances for Herod. And it so pleases him that he is going to give her anything she wants, and what she asks for is the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Why? Well, John the Baptist had been speaking out against Herod's marriage as incest, and that upset Herodias, and therefore she wants him dead. And Herod, making this vow before all of his guests, follows through and has John's head brought to Herodias on a platter. The word gets back to Jesus about this, and he is upset. He wants to spend some time alone. And who can blame him? I mean, yes, he is Jesus, and yes, he knows that the resurrection is coming, and he knows that he will see John again, but still, it affects him. It affects us. Death has a certain sense of tragedy to it. And so we see that now in Jesus' life as well. He wants to spend some time alone. He is going to miss John. However, when he does that, the crowds still want to follow him. We're going to pick up our story in Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 13. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. So they know Jesus needs a break. They know he needs some rest. But yet they still want to have their needs taken care of. We know folks like this in our lives, or maybe we've been those folks. Someone needs a break. They need some rest. And we say, you need to take a break. You need to get some rest, recharge your batteries. But first, before you do that, I need you to take care of some things. So it can be frustrating. I'm sure Jesus may have been a little frustrated. He wants to get alone to think about his friend. I mean, yes, he is Jesus. He knows there's a resurrection, but still, he needs some time alone. At the same time, the crowd is being persistent, which Jesus talks about in Luke. He talks about it in Matthew 13, about being persistent. And yet, this crowd is doing just that. They're tracking him down. They want to be with him. They want to hear from him. They want him to take care of them. And what does Jesus do? Verse 14. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and cured their sick. He takes care of them. Despite his own needs, he steps back, sees this crowd, and he takes care of them. And this goes on, it says, until evening. Now that's important. We're going to come back to that in a little bit, but these details are important. He takes care of them all the way through till evening. And then the disciples come to him. We're going to pick it up in verse 15. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." This would be a great out for Jesus, right? He can take a break, he can get away, they can go into town and get food. It's a win-win for everybody. But Jesus takes care of his people and has compassion on them. And so he turns to the disciples and says, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Now, in the Greek text here, that's emphatic. He said, you take care of this. Like, you see a need, right? You see these people that are hungry, then you take care of that. And they try. They bring them what they have available. They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves. Take note of the language he uses there. He blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. We call this the feeding of the 5,000. Very familiar story. So there's 5,000 men plus women and children. So let's just kind of round up and say there's 15,000, right? So man, wife, and child, just to round numbers. So 15,000 people are fed from 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, remember the importance of numbers. 5 loaves plus 2 fish is the number 7, or the number of completeness. So again, bear that in mind. Also, the language Jesus uses. He blessed and broke the loaves. We'll see that later as well. So look at the size of the miracle for a second, however. If you take an 8-ounce serving of bread, and let's say a 6-ounce serving of fish, that would be about 8,000 pounds of bread and about 6,000 pounds of fish. That's a lot of food. 8,000 pounds of bread, 6,000 pounds of fish, and yet only 12 baskets are left over. That's pretty accurate. Well, the number 12 isn't about actually how much was left over. It may have been 12 baskets, but the number is more important about what it means. 12. There are 12 disciples. There are 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is in Jewish territory here. He's feeding the Jewish people. And you have this meal now set before Israel. We had that with Moses and manna. We're also going to see it later in the gospel. And even more importantly, when we get to the climax of Matthew in chapter 15, we'll have another feeding like this one of 4,000. But I want you to note how many baskets are left over in that feeding and where Jesus is when that miracle takes place. So this miracle sets up that one. We have 5,000 plus women and children and 12 baskets left over, like the tribes of Israel. So there's another key here that I mentioned earlier. Remember, it was evening is mentioned here. Also, the way Jesus says, blessed and broke. There's another example that we have in the Gospels of Jesus doing something like this. It's at the Last Supper. It was evening. They're preparing for Passover. And Jesus blesses and breaks bread and gives it to the disciples. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of that great meal that Jesus shares with his disciples and with us, this large crowd of human history, where he eats with us. In fact, there is a church where it is believed this miracle took place in Galilee, in modern Israel, called Tabgha. And in this church, the Church of the Multiplication is called, there is a table, a communion table. And beneath that communion table is a stone where it is believed that this miracle took place and Jesus broke the bread and blessed the fish. If you look at this mosaic here, and this mosaic's made out of little tiny stones, you notice that there are 4 loaves and 2 fish. So 2 fish on the side, 4 loaves in the middle. Why is it that there are only 4 loaves? Is it that the artist forgot one? Or didn't have room in his mosaic? Of course not. Instead, where is the 5th loaf? The 5th loaf is on the table. The 5th loaf is Jesus himself. And so the artist who did this mosaic at this church in the earliest of Christian history saw that this miracle here of Jesus of the feeding of the 5,000 connects to communion, connects to the Lord's Supper when he eats with all of us. And it kind of highlights this compassion of Jesus, that he cares for us, that he takes care of us, that he will bring into this world where there's a lot of trouble and suffering and pain and hunger, he will bring his compassion and justice. He's one we can trust to take care of us, where he comes with us and actually shares a meal with us. And so in the feeding of the 5,000, we have a foreshadowing of the meal that we celebrate every week with fellow disciples. Jesus comes and eats with us because he cares for us, has compassion on us, and takes care of us. So we'll continue this next week. We'll finish up on chapter 14. But again, these stories are going to connect with what's going to happen at the climax in chapter 15. So if we're going to read ahead, that'd be great, and we'll see you next time. before the day ends.